We look upon the Bible as inspired divinely. Some of us a lot more literally, and some of us ignore it, but it has a huge impact on everything that our culture has ever made. So it's interesting to go back and think about it. How did the Bible come to be? If you go back and you look at the earliest days of the Christian church, they didn't have Bibles. What they had was they had stories, oral tales passed down from the people who had actually been there. The purest form of Christianity, of course, would have been those who were around the apostles and Jesus himself. And as they got old and died, they tried to leave notes of what it was like to the followers who were coming next, to those who had come next. And they in turn took those letters and they read them to friends and wrote those letters again to other friends. And in each case, things changed and drifted, as the point was not truth like we understand it now in this age of reason and ration. It was truth in the age of spirit and story. These letters spread from small church to small church, regardless of the persecution from the empire. And the Christian cult, as it was called at the time, continued to spread throughout the lands around the Mediterranean. Now, at some point, and for no apparent reason outside of maybe his own fairly unstable brain, the Emperor Constantine decided suddenly that in addition to being a worshiper of Mithras and half a dozen other cults, he would also become a Christian. And he legalized Christianity throughout the lands. Now, when he did this, he invited the bishops, all of the newly legitimized Christian cult leaders, to a great council called the Council of Nicea in roughly 325 AD. Now, I'd like you to imagine that we had 7 political parties, each as deeply divided as we have now between ours. This was the Council of Nicea. The bishops of Antioch, Constantinople, Jerusalem, Alexander, they had all come to their faith through letters separated by hundreds of people, different stories. They didn't even agree on which letters were more or less important to the faith. And they began to argue. And they argued, and they argued, and they argued, and they argued, and they argued. And in the end, the Emperor Constantine came to the Council of Nicea and said, and I'm paraphrasing here, y'all get your shit together. And he decided which creeds would become paramount to the new church. Now it's interesting to note from an artist's perspective that all of the art from the Christian cult up to that point focused on Jesus as the healer, Jesus as the lamb, and all the art after this began focusing on the cross and the crucifixion. Gone was the original symbol of the fish, and in its place came the cross. For the next 700 years, the Council of Nicea would continue to reconvene. And what they did in each of these councils was decide what things were heresy under the new Constantine rule. So think about this. Here we are 2,000 years after the death of Christ. How far are we removed from the original teachings, from the original thoughts, from the original stories, from the flavor, from the very world that made that possible? And all of the things we think about nowadays. Now let's go back to 325 AD. Just 300 short years, which isn't short, but think just 300 short years, and the two greatest competing doctrines for what would become the Christian church were the Marianite doctrine and the Arian doctrine. And the Arian doctrine, forget all of the Nazi things that came later. This was long before any of that. The Arian doctrine said Jesus was a man, a gifted teacher, someone who was not God, but had a special conduit to God. And of course, the side that won was the opposite side. But think about this. Here we are 2,000 years later, and we have these same discussions. mere 300 years after his death, those were the competing things. Have we moved at all? Have we come any distance? In the end, what formed the basis for the Bible was not spirit, was not research and intellectualism. What it was Bishop Jerome out of Rome, who had already translated a number of letters that he had run across from the original, or the closest to originals he could get, and from a previous edition made for the Eastern Orthodox Church, into what became the Bible, with guidance from Emperor Augustine. So, when we think about these people who are on stage in our politics right now, claiming the inerrancy of the Bible because of its spiritual beginnings, what we need to realize is it has always been in turmoil, always been in question, and like all human things, has always been corrupted by the politics of power.
True that.